Okay, this is Preventing Violence, Educational, Part 5. Singling out of the young for legally permitted degrees of violence and humiliation does not end with childhood. It continues and even intensifies after they reach puberty and young adulthood. For only the young, throughout history and in every nation on earth, have been forced to fight each other, killing and being killed in the wars that are declared by the middle-aged and elderly, wars in which they themselves are exempt from the obligation to risk their lives by engaging in frontline combat. The old saying that war is the revenge of the old on the young captures a deep psychological truth, one that is reflected in the revenge that the young adults themselves then take, first by committing most of the murders and rapes that are recorded, and then, after they reach middle age themselves, by inflicting the same violence on the young that was inflicted on them, whether as parents assaulting their own children, as political and military leaders sending the young to their deaths, in the endless vicious circle, and in this instance it really is vicious, of violence that repeats from one generation to the next. My point here is not to argue that there are never rational reasons for differentiating in law and custom between the rights and responsibilities that are accorded to people of different ages. The younger children are, the more helpless and dependent they are, and it would also be a form of child abuse not to recognize those differences. But it is one thing to distinguish between real differences in needs and abilities, and another to single out one group for disproportionate honor and deference, and another for disproportionate shaming and humiliation. My point here is simply to demonstrate how high is the price we pay any time we give respect to one group and deny it to another. One consequence of the way the old treat the young is that the highest rates of violent behavior occur among young males from when they first attain adult size and strength during adolescence until they reach the age at which they finally begin to accumulate some of the signs of status, which usually occurs around the beginning of middle age, 40 years or older. That age group alone, 14 to 39, commits more than 90% of the murders, assaults, and rapes in the world, and almost all of the military and political violence as well. Shame cultures versus guilt cultures. The frequency and type of violence vary enormously from one culture to another. Can we identify any characteristics that determine these differences? Yes. There is a great deal of evidence that the cultures whose members commit the most violence against others are those whose value systems, socialization practices, and major institutions have the effect of making their members especially sensitive and vulnerable to feelings of shame and humiliation. Expose them to situations that evoke those feelings and do not facilitate their developing the kinds of feelings that tend to inhibit violent impulses, such as feelings of guilt and remorse in response to harming others. And this, I think, is a big problem with the police right now. What's going on with the killing. Conversely, there is also much evidence that cultures that do the opposite have the least interpersonal and collective violence, but may suffer from the opposite problem: excessive feelings of guilt, sin, and responsibility, with a vulnerability to depression, masochism, martyrdom, and suicide. In other words, violence towards the self. This categorization of cultures derives from Ruth Benedict's concept of shame cultures and guilt cultures, which she introduced in the study of Japanese culture and personality that she prepared during the Second World War, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, 1946. As I will use these terms, I do not mean to imply that this difference between cultures is an either-or dichotomization, rather that it occurs along at least two major polarities. First, we can differentiate between those that are more or less pure. Hold on, I gotta shut this door. Okay. First, we can differentiate between those that are more or less pure shame or guilt cultures to the degree that they emphasize only one or the other emotion in their socialization practices and moral value systems, versus those that are mixed, emphasizing both emotions, and between extreme versus mild shame or guilt cultures, depending on the intensity and frequency of the shame or guilt to which their members are exposed. An example of a relatively pure and extreme shame culture would be the Kwakiutl Indians of Vancouver Island, as described by Ruth Benedict in 1934. The ultimate reason why a man of the Kwakiutl cared about the nobility, titles, the wealth, and the prerogatives, lays bare the mainspring of their culture. They used them in a contest in which they sought to shame their rivals. The object of all enterprise was to show oneself superior to one's rivals. This will to superiority was carried out with uncensored self-glorification and with jibes and insults poured upon the opponents. They stressed equally the fear of ridicule and the interpretation of experience in terms of insults. They recognized only one gamut of emotion, that which swings between victory and shame. And that's really important because our culture copies that, and you can see it all around you in the things that are going on in society today. Our defense, we have millions of bombs that are just sitting there, leaking into the soil, planes that are hardly ever flown, and yet the Department of Defense gets more and more trillions of dollars every year. For what? It's not necessary. There's already enough bombs, there's already enough guns, there's already enough, here, look at me, how big my dick is. We don't need any more. We need the money to go to other things, and that's why it's important for people to understand the dynamics of violence so that they can understand how to change that in our society. That this cultural pattern was associated with violence can be seen from the fact that they engaged in headhunting, cannibalism, burning slaves alive, and undiscriminating, merciless war and murder, even against totally innocent, unsuspecting, hospitable, sleeping friends, neighbors, relatives, and hosts, men, women, and children. They would vie with each other in committing atrocities, as Ruth Benedict's mentor and the first ethnographer of their tribe pointed out. The motive for this aggressiveness was a desire to wipe out feelings of shame and to maximize feelings of pride and social prestige. Aggressive behavior was an accepted and honored way of doing this, as Helen Coder also recognized, Fighting with Property, 1950. A shame culture is one in which the source of moral sanctions and authority is perceived to reside in other people, in their ridicule, criticism, or contempt, so that one is shamed in other people's eyes. The feeling of shame actually occurs in oneself, of course, and can occur when one is alone, but is characteristically perceived as something that occurs before an audience, an external judge in whose eyes, and by comparison with whom, one appears weak, failed, foolish, incompetent, ridiculous, rejected, inferior, contemptible, in short, shameful. Thus, shame motivates concealment of those traits in oneself, and I can think of a head of state to which this is very, very applicable. Thus, shame motivates concealment of those traits in oneself of which one is ashamed, since shame is only intensified by exposure to others. A guilt culture is one in which the source of moral sanctions and authority is oneself, one's own internalized conscience, and the moral law one imposes on oneself, violation of which leaves one feeling guilty and sinful in one's own eyes. By contrast with shame, the feeling of guilt or sin is actually relieved by exposure, which is why guilt cultures institutionalize the practice of confession of sins. This is understandable since the person who feels guilty perceives his sin, evil, as being inside himself, so to speak, so letting it out through confession can feel like draining a moral abscess, bringing a relief of painful pressure. And this is where guilt versus shame is very, very important to understand, and how these dynamics occur or do not occur within a particular individual, which would make them violent or not violent, because most people who feel guilt do not feel violent, but most people who feel shame have a higher propensity to violence. But why would the perceived source of moral sanctions and disapproval affect either the likelihood or the direction of violent impulses? The answer, I believe, is that what the feeling of shame motivates most directly is the wish to eliminate the feeling of shame, since it is a very painful feeling, and since shame is seen as emanating from other people, that can be done most directly by eliminating other people. It is true that one could also eliminate the feeling of shame at lower cost to oneself and others by means of achievements of which one could feel proud and which would elicit approval, admiration, respect, and honors from others. But that is not always possible, and when it is not, eliminating others may be seen as the only alternative. What the feeling of guilt motivates correspondingly is the wish to eliminate the feeling of guilt, since it is a very painful feeling, and since the feeling of guilt emanates from the self. The only way to eliminate it may be by eliminating the self, as in suicide, or by provoking or passively submitting to martyrdom. So shame is more likely to elicit violence towards others. Extreme guilt towards the self is more likely to elicit self-harm. Another way to understand why shame motivates anger and violence toward others, and why guilt directs those same feelings and behaviors toward the self, is to remember that in a shame ethic, the worst evil is shame, the source of which is perceived as other people, the audience in whose evil eyes one is shamed. Therefore, evil resides in other people, and to the degree that one feels shame, it is other people who deserve punishment. And this is why people who strike out feel justified in their violence. Punishing others alleviates feelings of shame because it replaces the image of oneself as a weak, passive, helpless, and therefore shameful victim of their punishment, i.e. their shaming, with a contrasting image of oneself as powerful, active, self-reliant, and therefore admirable and unshameable. In a guilt ethic, by contrast, the worst evil is to be guilty or sinful, and guilt and sin, to the degree that one feels guilty and sinful, are perceived as residing within oneself. Thus, people who feel guilty see themselves as deserving punishment, and receiving punishment, whether from oneself or from others, relieves guilt by expiating it. Indeed, that is the purpose of punishment, both in the criminal law, in which punishment is the means by which the criminal pays his debt to society and thus discharges his guilt, and in the religious sacrament of penance, the self-punishment by which the sinner expiates his sins, that is, relieves his guilt feelings. Thus, whereas punishment intensifies feelings of shame, it relieves feelings of guilt. I'm going to read that again because it's so important. It is the crux of the dynamic of everything that I'm trying to explain here. Thus, whereas punishment intensifies feelings of shame, it relieves feelings of guilt. A psychological fact that has important implications for the effect that punishment has on the level of violent crime in a society, as I will discuss further in Chapter 6. To feel shamed is to perceive oneself as being disrespected. And the most direct and rapid way to make others respect you is to make them afraid of you. And people who are bullied sometimes find this to be true, and then they become the bullied, or the bulliers, rather. They turn into what has been done to them because they feel it is the only way for them to protect themselves, is to become that which is plaguing them. This is, of course, an ersatz and costly form of respect, which people have no need of when they receive genuine respect from others, or when their feelings of self-respect are strong enough to maintain their self-esteem independent of respect from others. Genuine respect is earned. Genuine respect has nothing to do with fear, or might is right, or force, or shame. The feeling of shame is also the feeling of being ridiculed or of being vulnerable to ridicule. The most direct and certain way to stop people from laughing at you is to make them cry instead. In Shakespeare's Henry V, the French Dauphin ridicules Henry by making him a gift, not of royal treasure, but of tennis balls, to which Henry responds by threatening such violence against the French that thousands shall weep more than did laugh at it. This same principle still causes wars, as well as the kinds of violence that the legal system labels as criminal. Hitler, for example, was elected to power on the basis of the campaign promise to undo the shame of Versailles. Violence occurs when people see no means of undoing or preventing their own humiliation except by humiliating others and using force. Indeed, that is the underlying purpose of inflicting violence on others. That the values and socialization practices of pure and extreme shame cultures lead to violence is well documented by the cross-cultural data in the human relations area files. A quantified, computerized summary of the past century of research in cultural anthropology, in which several measures of shame show highly significant correlations with several indices of violence. The measures of shame included cultural traits such as extreme boastfulness, sensitivity to insult, and tell me if Anybody that you know rings a bell with this? Boastfulness, sensitivity to insult, invidious display of wealth, and a complete narcissism index. I know somebody very high up in government that resembles all of this. Summation of those and other indices. The cultures that scored high on those indices were significantly more likely than those with low scores to have a high incidence of warfare, bellicosity, I'm not sure what that is, killing, torture, and mutilation of enemies, pursuit of military glory, crimes against the person, violent crimes, slavery, alcoholic aggression, male genital mutilation, and so on. Since pure and extreme guilt cultures tend to prevent rather than cause violence towards others, I will discuss them in Chapter 5. Here it is relevant to note that significant correlations exist in the human relations area files data not only between the different indices of shame and of violence, but also between both of those variables and several different measures of social and economic inequality. Cultures that have social classes, those that have caste systems, and those that have still practice slavery all show significantly more of both shame and violence than cultures whose institutions do not divide people in those hierarchical ways. So, division of people in hierarchical forms, a division of people in any form, by any label, is an act of violence. Because it is a cause of violence, it becomes an act of violence because it directly impacts. The existence of inequality exposes everyone to the risk of being inferior, which in turn stimulates aggressive competition to inflict the inferior status on others, such as by enslaving, impoverishing, or degrading them. In other words, inequality stimulates shame, and shame stimulates the creation of inequality. Shame stimulates violence, and violence stimulates shame. These are vicious, vicious circles that until our country, until the mainstream understands very intimately this dynamic, which is why I'm reading this, to educate. These things are going to continue to happen because it's a vicious circle that you're going through and you're not examining the cause and dynamics of it or trying to stop it. Like, for instance, a lot of people, when their children are hitting each other, will hit them. So this is trying to teach nonviolence by using violence. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And yet this is the way that a lot of us are conditioned and taught to teach our children. Inequality leads to violence, and violence leads to inequality. These are all mutually reinforcing vicious circles or positive feedback loops. War and democracy. One of the most remarkable findings of recent scholarship in political science is that during the past century there have been no wars between well-established democracies. That's a study, the reference is Never at War, 1998. In the modern world, wars have only occurred when at least one of the combatants has been ruled by a dictatorship, oligarchy, or some other non-democratic form of government, or one that's masquerading as a democratic form of government, of which I believe I am a citizen of. Professor Jack Levy, Domestic Politics and War, 1989, has written that this absence of war between democracies comes as close as anything we have to an empirical law in international relations. This thesis, if it survives further empirical testing and theoretical analysis, of course has important implications for the prevention of war, which is why we'll return to it in the next chapter, but it also implies that a cause of war is an authoritarian political structure in which there's a high degree of inequality of power, which we are totally seeing today. Naturally, there's much room for debate about such a sweeping generalization, especially over definitions of democracy and of war, and over the theoretical understanding of why the correlation between democracy and peace exists. But the hypothesis seems to me to be plausible enough to pursue further, since it accords with the repeated and remarkably consistent findings in a variety of contexts that violence is associated to a statistically significant degree with higher degrees of inequity and hierarchy in the status systems of these social groups being studied, and becomes less frequent and intense the greater the degree of equality. So this is why you hear people going on and on about equality and Black Lives Matter and these kind of movements that are happening, is because this is an implicit understanding that people can feel because they experience it in this situation around them. This is the scientific culmination and explanation of how and why that occurs. Even authoritarian individuals are more violent than those whose values are more democratic and egalitarian, as shown in Adorno, The Authoritarian Personality, 1950, and The Authoritarian Spectre, 96, Altmaier. In fact, the highest scores in Adorno's study of authoritarianism or potential fascism, potential my ass, were violent criminals in San Quentin. The only neo-Nazis I myself have ever encountered anywhere have been violent inmates in the maximum security prison and violent patients in the prison mental hospital. The Adorno study, referring to Ruth Benedict's contrast between shame and guilt cultures, also found that authoritarian personalities were notably sensitive to feelings of shame and insensitive to guilt feelings. What is true of governments and individuals also seems to be true of families. As Murray Strauss and his colleagues have found in their 1980 and 1986 studies of violence in the family, domestic violence is less common the greater the degree to which power and decision-making are shared equally by both spouses. This is so important because the family unit represents a microcosm of what's going on in the outside world, which is considered the macrocosm. It's a dynamic that's getting bigger in a societal way. Perhaps relations between nations, despite their greater complexity, do not follow totally different laws. That is, the values that lead people to create authoritarian, inegalitarian power structures also lead them to be aggressive toward others, and it may only take one such party to a relationship to bring about a violent conflict. Violence, this is chapter 3, violence as proof of masculinity. If being treated as inferior or assigned an inferior position in a status hierarchy leads to feelings of inferiority and shame, and that in turn leads to rage and violence, then why are women not more violent than men? Haven't women been treated as inferior by men ever since the invention of patriarchy? Yet men commit much more violence than women do. Homicides, suicides, wars, executions, even the so-called unintentional violence that results from careless risk-taking. Understanding why men are more violent than women requires an understanding of the highly asymmetrical gender roles to which the members of each sex are assigned at birth in our patriarchal culture, and to which they are powerfully conditioned to conform throughout the rest of their lives by virtually all the institutions of our society. The relevant point here, okay, so the male culture is then the shame culture, and the female culture is then the guilt culture, which explains why women are less violent, because they're more likely to inflict violence upon themselves or upon children that are submissives than they are to be violent outwards towards the males or towards society. Okay. The relevant point here is that the differences in those gender roles make it possible for men to ward off or undo feelings of shame, disgrace, and dishonor by means of violence, whereas that is significantly less true for women. Masculinity in the traditional, conventional, stereotypical sex role of patriarchy is literally defined as involving the expectation, even the requirement of violence, under many well-specified conditions in times of war, in response to personal insult, in response to extramarital sex on the part of a female in the family, while engaging in all-male combat sports, etc. The Greek term for masculinity, andreia, the root of our word androgen, also means courage. The same is true of the Latin word for manliness and manhood, virtus, which also means bravery and courage. The word virtus itself derives from vir, ver, which means both man and soldier. In other words, to be a man is to be a soldier. Virtus is also the word from which our word virtue derives. In the warlike culture of ancient Rome, the original and primary meaning of virtue was courage, an indispensable master virtue for soldiers. In other words, the primary meaning of virtue equals courage, equals manliness, equals soldier, was the willingness to risk one's own life in violent combat with other men. The result of that is that men can prove their manliness, their masculine sexual adequacy, when it has been called into question by an insult or a sign of disrespect by means of violence, and their failure or unwillingness to engage in violence can throw their manliness into doubt and expose them to shame. And this explains why domestic violence occurs in many instances too, because as soon as the woman starts to, and this also would explain why they say that women need to shut their mouths. It's taken as a sign of disrespect from the man, which often is meant as a sign of disrespect. But when you're dealing with abuse and you're nice and the abuse is continuing to occur, you have to speak up, which is taken as a form of violence in and of itself. And it's responded to with more violence. Okay. Called into question by an insult or sign of disrespect by means of violence, and their failure or unwillingness to engage in violence can throw their manliness into doubt and expose them to shame. A woman's honor. How are things different for women? In order to discover the decisive difference between male and female gender roles and how they lead to differing rates of violent behavior, it will be helpful to ask what circumstances will augment or diminish shame or honor for a man, and are those the same as or different from the ones that will have that effect for a woman? And since I am a man, I thought it might be especially helpful to consult a woman. Virginia Woolf went some distance toward answering this question in 3 Guineas, 1938. Her powerful polemic against patriarchy and male violence. She wrote, "External observation would suggest that a man still feels it a particular insult to be taunted with cowardice by a woman in much the same way that a woman feels it a peculiar insult to be taunted with unchastity by a man, in other words, called a whore. For example, if we ask what are the worst, in other words, most shaming insults that can be hurled at a man or woman, respectively, what are they? My own external observation of violent criminals in prisons, among other men over the years, would suggest that for men, the insults that are most powerfully shaming and hence violence-provoking are those that call into question either courage or manliness, two psychologically and etymologically synonymous concepts. These include wimp, coward, sissy, and anything that throws doubt on one's status as a normal, potent, sexually adequate adult heterosexual male, such as weirdo, faggot, or fairy, the homophobic insult boy, the traditional insult given to adult black men in American South and South Africa, or the declaration that a man is effeminate or castrated and has no balls, or that he is a cuckold, which can be translated into patriarchies as not enough of a man to control his wife's sexuality. It is important to note that cuckold is a term applied exclusively to men, and there is no corresponding word for the woman whose husband is unfaithful to her, because obviously men being whores is advocated in our society and completely normal. I'm not saying that those are the only insults that are so powerfully shaming that they can constitute what the legal system has called fighting words, but that they are the insults that throw the most light on the differential social psychology of men and women. There are also racial insults, for example, which can be equally violence-provoking, but they are equally insulting to both sexes and are not specifically relevant to the differences between men and women. For women, the situation is entirely different. As Virginia Woolf suggested, women are insulted not by having their courage or their capacity for sexual activity called into question, but rather by accusations that they are too active sexually or active outside the bounds their gender role prescribes for them, meaning exclusively in marriage. Slut, whore, bitch, tramp. Just as cuckold is applied exclusively to men, promiscuous is applied almost exclusively to women. But what is most relevant here is that women are shamed not for being too submissive, dependent, unaggressive, and sexually inactive or impotent as men are, but rather for exactly the opposite traits, being too rebellious, independent, aggressive, and sexually active. Thus, if a woman responds to being shamed by becoming aggressive or violent, that may only lead to more shame rather than, as for men, to less. Violence on the part of women is regarded, according to patriarchal values, as unfeminine. Only men, for example, are expected and either permitted or forced to fight in wars, a convention that has only recently begun to be questioned. Even Lady Macbeth, when she was trying to talk herself into becoming violent, prayed to the gods of destruction to unsex me, for no woman could commit murder. And even then, she could only commit the murder vicariously, using her husband as the instrument of her will by shaming him and telling him he would be like a woman if he were too cowardly to kill Duncan. I'm not saying that no woman will respond by resorting to violence. Another great tragic heroine, Medea, shows how violent a woman can become when her husband shames her by an infatuation with another woman. I encountered a similar tragedy in reality in the Massachusetts prisons. A woman whose husband had decided to leave her for another woman killed their 2 children and eventually, unlike Medea, killed herself as well. What I'm saying rather is that violence is not a ready-made, gender-specific means of undoing shame for women as it is for men. It simply does not work as well. If one shames a woman enough, as Medea was, or as many women of color are shamed in the United States, one can elicit violence in a woman that can be just as homicidal as the violence of a man. The central implication, okay, so I want to make an important distinction here, because it's really easy for a woman to say, no matter what I say to a guy or what I do to a guy, he should be able to walk away. No. Actually, women do have a responsibility to manage their level of disrespect towards a man and the things that she's saying to him, because it can elicit violence from a man very easily and oftentimes does. And there is, it takes 2. So there is a responsibility there. Not always to keep your mouth shut, because I believe it's very important to stand up to might is right and, an iron fist. But the manner in which you do it, you have to be really careful with. And I've learned this from personal experience, being a mouthy bitch myself. So, and also that's me taking responsibility. I have to take responsibility we all have to take responsibility for the things that we say and do. Freedom of speech is important. But also choice of speech is important. So, and righteous anger, of course, is allowed, but sometimes righteous anger can get you in just as much trouble as unrighteous anger can, and violence. Okay, the central implication of all of this is that in patriarchal societies, men are assigned the role of violence objects, and women are assigned the role of sex objects. Notice the terminology objects, because in our culture, we tend to objectify people, just the way we objectify things, possessions. And this is like a conditioning in our society. It's not just certain people are just like this. I mean, it's an ongoing thing. It's like a battering ram, it's drilling into your head all the time. And if you're not aware of it, you can fall prey to it. That is, men and only men are assigned the role of fighting in wars, and they are not given any choice about the matter. If they refuse to treat other men as objects of violence and thereby simultaneously become objects of those men's violence, they will be shamed and insulted, called cowards, and then turned into objects of their own army's violence. Okay, so this is really important too, because when a man is faced with fight or flight, if he doesn't want to fight and he wants to be peaceful, he's then shamed, which often elicits violence. So it's either be violent or be shamed into violence. So men often do not feel they have a choice in the matter. Okay, deserters have traditionally been shot, and just as men are shamed for refusing to treat other men and themselves as violence objects, they are honored for being willing to do so, like the Purple Heart, for instance. People who are in the military are often promoted depending and given, pride by the number of people that they have killed. And so this is reinforcing this violent, aggressive behavior. And in essence, telling a man that that's the only logical way that he can survive in our society. And that's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Violence times violence equals more violence, and we're seeing it all over today. George Bernard Shaw said that if a man steals 100 pounds, he is sent to jail, but if he steals 1,000,000 pounds, he is sent to Parliament. I believe the same principle applies to male violence. If a man kills one person, he is sent to prison. If he kills 10, to a prison mental hospital. But if he is responsible for the death of thousands, he is crowned emperor, made the Duke of Marlborough, or elected president of the United States. And unfortunately, that is sad but true. The opposite of shame is honor. And the highest honor given by the United States is the Congressional Medal of Honor. Who is it given to? Men. And for what? For violence, or more precisely, for turning themselves and other men into objects of each other's violence. I do not say this in order to shame those who sacrifice their own safety or even their own lives in the attempt to save their comrades in arms and the rest of us from the violence of other men. I am mentioning these facts in order to clarify the causes of male violence and to clarify why most lethal violence is committed by males against males, so that we can improve our ability to prevent all violence. My point here is to show why violence can be for men a very powerful way to ward off shame and to achieve pride and honor instead, whereas it does not serve that purpose for women nearly as frequently or effectively. What women are honored for, or under conditions of patriarchy, is not violence, but sexual chastity outside marriage and fidelity and fertility within marriage. I am calling that female gender role the equivalent of being a sex object because it means that the woman is obliged to renounce her own sexual subjectivity. She is not permitted to have sexual wishes and activities of her own choosing, before, during, or in some cultures even after marriage, but must instead be her husband's sex object. A woman in most patriarchal circumstances of circum-Mediterranean shame and honor cultures will typically be honored for being a virgin until marriage and shamed if she is not. From this comes the tradition in some peasant cultures of hanging bloody sheets outdoors the morning after the newlyweds' first night together as a means of proving that neither the family's nor the new husband's honor has been destroyed by unchastity in the bride. By contrast, a man in such cultures may be shamed for being a virgin at marriage, so at puberty he is traditionally taken by his father or older brother to a house of prostitution or introduced to a mistress. The fact that both women and men assign themselves and other women and men to the gender roles I've just described to the extent that they have internalized the values of patriarchy, down with the patriarchy, and that both women and men enforce their conformity to these roles can be seen by examining the epidemiology of violent crime. In the developed nations, at least, both women and men assign men to the role of violence objects, for both women and men are more likely to kill a man than they are to kill a woman. That is, both sexes see it as more appropriate to kill a man than to kill a woman. The only part of the world in which that might not be true, as a statistical generalization, is in certain Asian societies such as India and China, where lethal violence toward females such as bride burning and female infanticide, killing the female babies, or restricting the ability to have them in the first place, are apparently all too common. I do not know how accurate these statistics are in those developing nations, but there is a discrepancy between reported death rates in which men are in the majority as they are throughout the rest of the world, and overall census figures in which men are also reported to outnumber women, which is not true anywhere else in the world. Another exception, in the most traditional patriarchal societies, women who are perceived as having dishonored the men in their family by engaging in premarital or extramarital sex may be killed by male relatives. And, this is going on in the Middle East all the time, stoning to death of women, women who are seeking equality in any form, really. So as a collective, a human collective, we have a long way to go before women are considered equal to men in every respect across the globe. Even in less rigidly patriarchal societies such as the UK and the US, marital infidelity on the part of the wife is one of the more frequent precipitants of wife murder. But those exceptions only prove the rule, I think, about the nature of gender roles. For the woman who renounces her assigned gender role, which is to be the sex object of her husband, and allows herself to have some sexual subjectivity of her own, thereby also renounces the protection her assigned gender role gave her from violence. The statistics on sexual violence show the opposite pattern. There it is very clear that women are seen as sex objects, for the vast majority of victims of rape are women, a gender disparity that also applies to incest. In fact, being a rape victim is perhaps the most extreme example of what it means to be a sex object. By definition, the subjective wishes and will of the rape victim are ignored by the rapist. My point here is to distinguish between two types of violence, physical and sexual, in the same way that child abuse is differentiated into physical abuse, the battered child syndrome, infanticide, and sexual abuse, incest, pedophilia. Both are forms of violence, of course, but they show important differences in their epidemiology and their consequences, which I believe can throw light on the psychology both of gender roles and of violence. I've used the terms violence object and sex object for the sake of brevity, but that of course does not mean that rape is not a violent crime. Physical violence can be defined as the inflicting of physical injury or death, and sexual violence as the violation of a person's sexual autonomy. When men are raped by other men, as many are in prisons, the overt, conscious, symbolic meaning of the event is that they are being turned into women, effeminized, which is a source of shame. For example, in prisons in the southern U.S., a male inmate who has been raped is called a gal boy. To be a sex object is to be a woman, and vice versa in the culture of violence called patriarchy. A form of violence towards men and women that may superficially appear to be more or less identical, namely genital mutilation, in fact, also exemplifies and confirms the same gender role differentiation. The purpose of mutilating a girl's genitals is to render her sexually anesthetized and inactive, so as to facilitate the task of turning her into a sex object who will be a virgin before marriage and monogamous after marriage. This is done by removing the basis of her sexual subjectivity, her capacity to have sexual desires and activities of her own, by removing her clitoris and sewing her labia shut. The purpose of mutilating a boy's genitals is, on the contrary, to turn him into a violence object, for the meaning of this ordeal for the boy in most cultures that practice such initiation rites is to challenge him to develop and demonstrate the physical courage and the ability to tolerate physical pain and injury that are a prerequisite for being a warrior, that is, a violence object. And you'll notice again and again that these dynamics are prevalent in our society, and in this turning of human life into possession, into an object, into an inanimate outside rag doll or toy or tool, if you will. It is through passing this test without flinching, crying, or fleeing that he proves he has become a man, that is, someone who is brave enough to let himself become a violence object. For that he will be honored, just as he will be shamed, treated as not a real man for showing any signs of pain or fear. And this goes on, to what is our society teaching our boys? That to show pain or to show fear is to not be a man. Therefore, they internalize everything. It bottles up like, a cork busting open on a wine bottle, and that violence ends up exploding all over the place when they're that shoving in of feeling and not being able to express and be recognized as a vulnerable, sensitive human being, where that is thwarted, violence is going to crop up its head in one form or another, towards the self or towards others. Homophobia. Another closely related source of violence is homophobia, by which I mean the attitude of fear, hatred, and contempt for homosexuality and homosexuals. The reason for homophobia has long been recognized as the fear that one is or is thought to be homosexual oneself, which to the homophobic person is a source of intolerable shame and motivates behavior designed to prove one's heterosexuality. This is particularly likely to result in violence when the homophobic person is a man, because the most direct defense against the fear that one is or could be suspected of being homosexual is to engage in an exaggeration of the heterosexual sex role stereotype. And since violence is part of that definition of masculinity, exaggerated masculinity is likely to take the form of exaggerated violence. People see this where extreme hatred towards homosexuals is seen. And oftentimes, closet homosexuals exhibit a increased level of masculine behavior in order to try and cover up the truth of their real sexual orientation of homosexuality. Defenses against the fear of being or appearing to be homosexual may take a variety of other forms besides violence, of course, such as sexual promiscuity in men, the Don Juan syndrome, although it should be remembered that the original Don Juan committed both rape and murder, machismo, of which violence is only one component, and the avoidance of anything that resembles the feminine sex role stereotype, such as tenderness, intimacy, nurturance, passivity, dependency, forgiveness, vulnerability, and the capacity to feel anything. Which means that our society is sends men the silent message that they have to be apathetic. They cannot care about anything. And I think that this really comes and hooks into the police brutality. And the capacity to feel anything, physical or emotional, including pain, fear, depression, love, compassion, vulnerability, sadness. The only feeling that many violent men will let themselves feel is anger, rage, and hatred. And here we find neo-Nazis in this category, police, heads of state. That this is the emotion that most closely and directly precedes and stimulates violent behavior is hardly surprising, of course. What I was surprised to observe, however, in the most macho and violent men I worked with, was that they would not allow themselves to even have that feeling. Perhaps this is because being angry reveals that you have something to be angry about, and is too revealing of the fact that you can be hurt by others. Thus, the motto of the most violent men of all could be summarized in the aphorism, "Don't get mad, get even," which is so dangerous because this starts this huge vicious circle of retributive violence that, is seen in, like Romeo and Juliet with the families warring and stuff. It never ends, and the other person always has to have the last hit. Violence is most common when both the shame and the rage that it causes are unacknowledged, even to the self, so that both feelings are effectively unconscious. So imagine pushing all of this down into yourself to such a degree that you don't even realize that you're feeling something. The only way it can come out is in some way that you are not even conscious of, but it ends up coming out. The psychodynamic logic that makes homophobia a generator of violence rests on the fact that the most direct and concrete ways to prove that one does not love men are to murder men and rape women. And you'll see this in war, because it's all men usually together. They're gone for months at a time to another country. They don't have the ability to be affectionate or sexual with the women that they normally have. So they will rape the native women wherever they are at, and kill the men. These communicate the messages, "I do not love men, I hate them, and to prove that, I will show you how much I hate them by killing them." And "I do not desire men sexually, I desire women, and to prove that, I will show you how much I desire them by raping them." I emphasize the importance and centrality of homophobia as a cause of male violence because I was confronted with evidence of it on a daily basis in my work with the most violent men our society produces in the most violent environment, the prison. This is an environment that stimulates homophobia, and it also stimulates homosexuality. Given the high incidence of, because everybody's all together and they're all males and they're all being denied their sexuality, giving saltpeter so they can't even get an erection, which in and of itself is a shameful experience, because not being able to get it up is considered an unmanly thing, or that people are shamed for it. Okay, an environment that stimulates homophobia, given the high incidence of the rape of male prisoners by other male prisoners, most of whom would kill you if you made the mistake of imagining that their raping other men meant that they themselves were gay. So this is like really gets really twisted in people's minds, but this is how it operates, and this is why. For example, there are a few psychological crises in a male prisoner's life that are more likely to result in his going berserk and assaulting everyone in his environment than the phenomenon called homosexual panic, a mental state that includes the fear that he is surrounded by homosexual men who are bent on raping him or turning him into a homosexual or a woman. Which, is it so far-fetched to have a fear like that if you are surrounded by men who, if you don't exhibit violence towards them, will rape you and turn you effeminate? I mean, it's not imagined. It's very real in these instances. But it can be exaggerated in the mind of a person who is in that situation. Conflicts over homosexuality, both intrapsychic and interpersonal, have been reported by most observers, myself included, to be among the main causes of the homicides that occur in prisons. But it would be a mistake to think that the homophobia that these men experienced and to which they responded by becoming violent was simply a rational response to the real danger of being raped by other men in the unique environment of the prison. For many of the murders that these men had committed in the community before they had ever been inside a prison revolved around the same issue. So, like, again, the prison is a microcosm of the macrocosm of society. And that's why when he went into the prisons, he was able to relate this to all of society in a larger way, which is so important. For many of the murders these men committed in the community before they had ever been inside a prison revolved around the same issue. One man who had run away from home at the age of 12 after his abusive alcoholic father attacked him with a butcher knife had found no way to support himself on the streets except by working as a male prostitute. After some years of that, a man that he picked up made the mistake of assuming that the fact that he worked as a male prostitute meant that he was gay. His response was immediate and lethal. Killing the man was the only way he could imagine to prove that he was heterosexual. But even in cases where the link to homophobia is not so immediate and obvious, I am convinced that homophobia underlies most male violence. I say that because, as I explained in my earlier book, violence is to behavior what paranoia is to thoughts. Violence is to behavior what paranoia is to thoughts. Violence is the behavioral equivalent of paranoia, the acting out of the core delusion that other people are dangerous to oneself and that one can only defend oneself by attacking or even killing them. And this is so important about police brutality, this right here. I'm going to read it again. Violence is the behavioral equivalent of paranoia, the acting out of the core delusion that other people are dangerous to oneself and that one can only defend oneself by attacking or even killing them. And this is basically what a lot of cops are feeling when they go out onto the beat, is that people are dangerous and that they can only defend themselves by attacking or killing them. And this is why these guns are being drawn and people are being killed so quickly. It is not a it is not a wait and see what happens and then pull your gun. It is not even a pull your gun and wait to see what happens. It is a pull the gun and kill the person before they even get words out of their mouth, while they're just reaching for something like their inhaler or their license, which the cop has asked them to provide. That is why what looks like offensive violence to observers always feels like self-defense to the violent person. And this is why a lot of cops, I think, are not charged, is because not only of the protections that they benefit from within police unions and the absolute power of the positions that they are allowed to be in, but also it is easy for people to say, I thought that this person was going to shoot me, so I shot them first. They, sometimes do truly believe that they're justified in what they're doing because to them it looks that way and it is justified in their minds. I believe that Freud was profoundly correct when he traced the etiology of paranoia to homophobia, in which the paranoid delusion is a defense against a shame-provoking perception of oneself as homosexual. The thought processes that produce paranoid delusions, as Freud saw, consist of denial and projection. Denial that I love him by reversing it into I hate him, and projection of that thought onto the other person, reversing I hate him into he hates me. Homophobia, patriarchal or sexist attitudes with a devaluation of everything female and an overvaluation of everything masculine, a defensive exaggeration of the male gender role in the form of a kind of hypermasculinity or machismo, and the constant threat or reality of violence. I have never seen such an intensification of all those attitudes as I did in the prisons. In fact, the prisons were not only a pure culture of violence, as I said earlier, but also a pure culture of patriarchy, machismo, and homophobia. And that is one of the reasons why corrections needs to be changed and needs to be completely flipped upside down, because these are breeding grounds for more violence. And that is why a lot of people, when they get out, they're committing not only the same crimes, but they're committing them in better ways because they've all been sitting there in this cesspool and learning from each other how to be better criminals, essentially. So they put them all together in a violent atmosphere, tell them not to be violent while all they're being taught around them is violence. That's fucked up. And they're supposed to somehow get out of that on their own without any resources or support or education. Go figure. So, and this really comes down to also the incentivizing of not solving, with money. Why solve the problem when you can just keep the problem going and can keep making money off of it? If you actually solve the problem, then you're not going to be able to make money off of it anymore because the problem's been solved. This goes for healthcare, this goes for the prison system, this goes for a lot of the ills of our society. Because it's money driven, there's incentive to keep the game going and not actually solve the problem, or to deal with symptoms instead of causes. You can always deal with a symptom, but that's not going to stop the root cause. Homophobia, patriarchal, or sexist attitudes with a devaluation of everything female. Oh, okay, I already read that part. Since all these attitudes seem to group themselves together and to reinforce each other, thus forming a syndrome, and since their defensive purpose seems so transparent, namely to reassure the individual that he's a real man whose sexual adequacy as a man cannot be doubted, I could not help but conclude that perhaps homophobia also underlies the whole value system and cultural pattern that we call patriarchy. I'm going to read that again because it's so important. Could not help but conclude that perhaps homophobia also underlies the whole value system and cultural pattern that we call patriarchy. Now, this is really interesting because this explains why people of the cloth are often found to be pedophiles. It explains why people in the Boy Scouts, the heads of the Boy Scouts, have ultimately been revealed as pedophiles. It explains heads of government that are pedophiles, military that are homosexuals and pedophiles. Like, these things are the patriarchal structure of our society is homophobia, according to this guy, and it does make a lot of sense. Since all these attitudes seem to group themselves together and reinforce each other. Okay, this includes the exaggerated polarization of gender roles, the purpose of which is clearly to prove something that would need no proof if it were not doubted, namely that men are men and women are women and never the twain shall meet, okay? And this is why this aggression towards trans people, towards gay people, towards bisexual people even, is such a huge problem. Prisons are, among other things, a microcosm of the society that produces them, but a microcosm in which some of the problems that exist in the society at large are so concentrated, distilled, and exaggerated that we can see more clearly they're some of the uglier or at least more dangerous and destructive aspects of our society. And I'm going to end this section. This is the end of chapter 3. And this just gives you something to chew on here and really think deeply about. That's why I'm doing this, is because nobody's talking about this. You'll see little parts of it here and there and snippets, but it most certainly isn't usually related to scientific inquiry or study, and usually is in such disarray when people are expressing it that the cohesiveness in the larger picture is not seen. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you continue to watch this series of preventing violence and educational. Thank you.